Brian Christopher Lawler was a professional wrestler born January 10, 1972, to Mother Kay and his father, professional wrestling legend Jerry the King Lawler. Brian officially began his wrestling career in the Memphis, Tennessee-based wrestling promotion, United States Wrestling Association, in 1988 as one half of the masked tag team, the Twilight Zone, teaming with his best friend from high school, Tony Williams, under the ring names of Nebula and Quasar. The two later became known as the New Kids, but eventually they decided to go their separate ways. Brian began competing in singles matches under the name Sexy Brian Christopher. He soon became a fan favorite, as well as making his mark as one of the USWA's top villains. There he feuded with wrestlers such as Jeff Jarrett, Bill Dundee, Tom Pritchard, Doug Gilbert, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, the Moondogs, and Scotty Flamingo, who was better known to the wrestling world as Raven. During his time in the USWA, Brian even had a feud with his father, Jerry Lawler, though his relation to Jerry was kept secret for many years. That is until 1999, when fellow wrestler Doug Gilbert broke kayfabe and admitted Brian was Jerry's son during a Power Pro Wrestling shoot interview on live TV.
It kind of hurts me, Dave, there's things we're not supposed to talk about out here, right?
That's true.
But, they told me a few things in the back that I couldn't talk about, but I don't really remember so long because his daddy...
Wait.
Because his daddy, Jerry Lawler, owned the company! I'm sorry, Dave. I know I wasn't supposed to say...
Then in 1997, Brian began his career in the WWE as Sexy Brian Christopher. In 1999, he teamed up with Scott Taylor to form the tag team of Cool, and Brian began to perform using the name Grandmaster Sexay, and Taylor used the name Scotty, Hottie. They were later joined in the group by Rikishi. They won the tag team titles in 2000 from Edge and Christian. However, the Cool trio was separated later that year when Rikishi made a heel turn, and then the tag team was derailed in February 2001 when Taylor was sidelined with an injury. While Scotty was sidelined in 2001, Brian formed a brief tag team with Steve Blackman, but was later released from the WWE after being caught attempting to transport drugs across the border between Canada and the United States. Upon his departure from the WWE, Brian began wrestling for the World Wrestling All-Stars promotion, competing against the heavyweight champion Jeff Jarrett. From June 2002 through April 2004, Brian went on to work for Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, this time as Brian Lawler, his first time ever competing using his family name. He formed a stable called Next Generation with fellow second-generation wrestlers David Flair and Eric Watts, in which the group was involved in a rivalry with the American Dream Dusty Rhodes. In April 2004, Brian was given a second chance and was signed to the WWE by Jim Ross in his last act as WWE Talent Scout. However, 1 month later, he was released from the WWE by the new head of talent relations despite Christopher being scheduled to take part in a battle royal to become the #1 contender for the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. Upon leaving the WWE for the second time, Brian would go on to wrestle for several independent promotions, including the Memphis wrestling territory. On the March 14, 2011 episode of Raw, Brian returned to the WWE as a heel, this time in a segment between Michael Cole and Brian's father, Jerry Lawler. Siding with Cole, Brian said he came to Raw to expose Jerry Lawler. Christopher would go on to blame Lawler for never being there for him as a child, to which Lawler told Christopher that he was a bigger screw-up than Charlie Sheen. It was a very entertaining segment. Christopher returned to the WWE once again on January 5, 2014, appearing on the old school edition of Raw and reuniting with Rikishi and Scotty in a six-man tag team match, this time managing to get the victory. His final work for World Wrestling Entertainment came in February 2014 when he appeared on WWE's developmental promotion NXT, along with his longtime tag partner Scotty, competing for the NXT Tag Team Championship titles as mystery opponents for the Ascension, who were the champions. Despite putting on a great match, they were unsuccessful at beating the Ascension for the belts. Brian would continue to wrestle in various independent promotions until wrestling his final match in November of 2017. On July 7, 2018, Sergeant Chris Wilkerson of the Hartman County Sheriff's Department claims he noticed a vehicle speeding and crossing the yellow line headed south on Highway 125. He claims to have attempted to pull Brian over just as Brian was turning onto the road where he lived in Middleton, Tennessee. Wilkerson then followed Brian home as Brian was making a left onto his driveway. After Wilkerson approached Brian and claimed that Lawler had the smell of alcohol on him and an open 12-ounce can in the center console, the report said. A standard field sobriety test, according to the document, suggested that Brian was impaired. Brian would tell his father and brother another version of the incident, according to the Daily Beast, insisting that, on this night, he hadn't been drinking at all. Because of this, he claimed, he made a deal with this sergeant. Give me a breath analyzer, and if I blow a zero, I can go home. The police report states that Brian blew a 0 per 210 liters of breath. Regardless, he was taken to the Hartman County Jail and charged with DUI, evading arrest and driving with a revoked license. As he was being booked, Brian told his father. One of the other deputies leaned in and motioned at Wilkerson. You know how your father is the king of wrestling? The officer allegedly asked. Well, that guy over there is the king of DUI. When you get a DUI from him, he makes it stick. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's toxicology report would determine that no basic drugs had been detected in Brian's bloodstream. However, there were traces of oxycodone and oxymorphone. Lawler's lawyer, Rosenblum, attributed this to Brian's legal medications for chronic pain, a knee injury, anxiety, and depression. The attorney described the amount of opiates as at most consistent with what you would expect in a person who was taking medication prescribed by a doctor. According to the Daily Beast, Jerry Lawler, after receiving a call, drove out to the Hartman County Jail in Bolivar, Tennessee. Upon entering the building, he was greeted by grinning correctional workers asking for autographs and selfies. It was like a personal appearance, he said. Sheriff John Julin joined Jerry and Brian in their conversation and reminded Brian that they'd met a year or so earlier. Lawler said Brian had appeared to be driving erratically, and the lawman personally followed him home. He asked Brian if he remembered, and he did, Lawler said, and the sheriff told him, "That's because I care about you. Now go into the bathroom and look in the mirror." He went into the bathroom, and he looked terrible. I was crying. Brian was crying. Lawler had come to the jail to bond out his son, but now he had second thoughts. When Brian returned to his cell, Lawler and Julin spoke. It was pointless to bring Brian home. Lawler claims that the sheriff told him, since the younger man was scheduled for a court appearance the next week, at which time he'd be sentenced to a mandatory 90 days for DUI and evading arrest. The days spent behind bars would count as time served. He told me, "This is the safest place for Brian to be because we will get him the help that he needs," Lawler said. "I will personally look out for Brian. Brian will be safe in here." So Lawler made a fateful decision. He told Julin to leave Brian in custody. "I was hoping staying in jail would mean he finally got help," Lawler said. That's what the sheriff promised, that they had a rehab program in jail. But Brian was never treated for drug, alcohol, or mental health issues at the Hartman County Jail.
Mary Jo Lawler was an inmate at the Hardeman County Jail serving time for a DUI arrest that happened earlier this month when corrections officers found him. Medics rushed him to Regional 1 Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 3:40 this afternoon. He was 46 years old. TBI special agents are investigating after Hardeman County corrections officers found him hanging in his cell Saturday night. Lawler was booked into the Hardeman County Jail for a DUI incident that happened July 7th.
Lawler's life ended this weekend after the 46-year-old hanged himself inside the Hardeman County Jail and died Sunday at Regional 1 Medical Center in Memphis.
Man, just gonna miss him forever.
The TBI is now investigating what happened. In a statement, Sheriff John Doolin said, because of his notoriety, staff placed Lawler in a cell by himself, but staff were given no indication he was suicidal. Attorney Jeff Rosenblum said the Lawler family deserves answers.
And if Brian Christopher didn't have people to talk to, and didn't have the right ongoing evaluation to determine his levels of depression and perhaps oncoming suicidal ideation, that would be problematic for me.
Have you heard anything official from anyone official?
No, that's the sad thing. I mean, it seems it's like a nightmare that we can't wake up from. It seems like every day something new comes up. We hear something from someone that it was either an eyewitness to incidents that happened the day that Brian died, or people that have heard stories about just different things that went on in the jail. Well, as I said, like you said, 10:30 that morning, I was in Raleigh, North Carolina. I received a phone call from Brian, a collect call that's monitored and recorded, and it's timed. 15 minutes is all you could talk at the time. And so that morning, though, he talked perfectly rational, perfectly normal. Just went on a little bit about how we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with the sheriff there, and Brian just went on about how none of the stuff that the sheriff had promised would take place had taken place, and there's just, you know, he just talked about the bad conditions there in the jail. Then we got cut off mid-sentence after 15 minutes, and didn't hear anything until about 2:30 in the afternoon. My fiance Lauren got a call from someone, well, actually, I spoke with the sheriff and said that Brian had been involved in an altercation with another inmate. There was a fight, and the sheriff's actual words were Brian was acting a fool and picked a fight with somebody that he shouldn't have picked a fight with, and then he got a laceration over his eye, and that they stitched him up and he was fine. Of course, we heard later on from an eyewitness to that fight that it went nothing like what the sheriff said. Then, you know, then a few hours later, we get a call. I got another call there in Raleigh from a deputy sheriff that said, "Mr. Lawler, I've got some bad news. Your son Brian has hung himself in the jail." So it was just, you know, from what talking to Brian earlier in the day and then hearing about the incident in the afternoon, and then all the way to the fact that, you know, he was gone that evening, it just doesn't add up. And so many of the eyewitnesses that have spoken to us and got in touch with us, the stories just don't jive. He was going to put Brian in touch with a gentleman that would help him work out a rehab program. Some other things were said about the actual charges being dismissed or lowered, and Brian was just saying, "Dad, all that stuff that we were told, it's not happened. It just, you know, we've got lied to." Till this time, we haven't really been able to get any answers from anybody.
There are those haunting hospital pictures showing the hang marks did not go around Brian's neck. Conflicting reports about whether video exists of a jailhouse fight Brian was in before his death. Disturbing reports from Brian's fellow inmates on why they don't think it was a suicide. And perhaps most frustrating of all, still no autopsy report from the medical examiner, now almost 6 months later.
At least 200 people turned out here at Hope Church to pay their respects to the man known as Brian Christopher. There were signs of his personality in the many Pittsburgh Steelers and wrestling memorabilia displayed. Multiple people shared stories about Brian. A lot of them actually made people laugh. Fitting for the guy who family and friends say loved to make people happy and would take the time to help anyone he could.
The TBI was already investigating the July death of wrestler Brian Lawler when another man, Gregory Sharon, was found unresponsive in his jail cell Wednesday night.
The TBI spent the day at the jail Thursday investigating Sharon's death. This picture was taken that day by the mother of wrestler Brian Lawler.
Wake up every single morning just hoping that it was all a dream, and then of course, you know, the reality hits you that it wasn't. I used to hate to hear the word closure, but now it's almost like, you know, that's really what we're looking for. You want to know what actually happened to your loved one.
Wrestling legend Jerry Lawler is talking about his son Brian. According to the lawsuit, Brian, who was also in the wrestling business, had a major depressive disorder along with a history of drug and alcohol problems. He committed suicide in the Hardeman County Jail 1 year ago.
Bond had been set and bond could have been made, and the decision was not to make the bond because of the promises and assurances made by Sheriff Doolin to Jerry Lawler that he would protect his son and make sure that he got some help for the alcohol and drug addiction issues that had been plaguing Brian.
The lawsuit says Brian Lawler had a head injury from a fight earlier in the day. He had been put in a solitary confinement room that had metal bolts sticking out from walls. Investigators say Lawler used a bolt as an anchor and his shoelaces to commit suicide.
Lawler family has asked me to shine a bright spotlight on all of the deficiencies at the Hardeman County Jail.
If we can prevent another family from going through what we have gone through for the past year, that's what we would like to see happen.
Last month, Sheriff John Doolin sued Hardeman County himself, saying he wasn't being given money and equipment needed to safely run the county.
Whether Brian Christopher Lawler really did take his own life or not is unfortunately a question that we may never have the answers to. One thing is for certain, this tragedy was preventable, and several things in the situation are suspicious. Like, why were there at least 20 cameras that day that were not working in the jail? Why were there no marks on the front of Brian's neck from the shoestrings? Why would he be allowed to even have shoestrings in the first place? And most importantly, should Brian have rightfully even been in the jail given the result of his breathalyzer test and the story Brian told to his father concerning the arrest? I hope and pray someday that the truth will come out and that his family will get the answers that they truly deserve to have.